Good evening. As we snuggle around this Yemen fire just here, it's great that you made it out. You found the place. That's fantastic. Most of my family's here in Brisbane. My mum is from Sherburne. My dad's from Tweed Heads, but most of my family's from here. And so it's special for me to be. I've been back after 20 years of down south, and for anyone who's Queenslander, down south is anywhere, New South Wales or down there. So I've been down south for 20 years and I was back just for over 12 months. So it's great for me to be back on what I feel is home country, even though we've got a loose family connection to the Turrbal people and the Jaeger mob. We live out in Kapalaba way, so Kondamuka country more or less, out that way in the Bayside. But it's fantastic for me to be back home and to be with I could say the best thing about being home is all the family, and then the worst thing about being home is all the family. So you get that love and support that you always want, but you also get that, where you going, what are you doing? What's happening? I saw you over here, where were you been? You try and go to another part of the city, you think you can get away and muck around on the other part of the city, and someone says, hey, aren't you so-and-so's son? Yeah, that's good. So it's great for me to come here and share with you tonight about some of my story and a bit about why I am a supporter for the recognition campaign, Recognise. Yes, I am wearing an R shirt. I wear this shirt every Friday, not just this one, I have a couple in rotation, but I wear an R shirt every Friday as a way to just present the branding out there. And often people will say, oh, I've seen that R, I don't know what it's about. I've heard kind of vaguely what it's about, and I'd be interested to know a bit more about it. One of the really funny encounters for me was when I got onto one of those Qantas planes, the Dash 8 Qantas planes, and they actually have this R emblem on the side of it, a couple of them. And I got onto one of those planes, and then I was there with a couple of colleagues also in their R shirts, and the flight attendant said to me, oh, so what's the R about? And I was like, it's about constitutional recognition. Qantas supporting it's on your plane. She goes, oh yes, of course, I knew that. So, even she was like, yeah, well, Qantas does support it, and I'm on a plane that's got it on it, but I still don't have my head around what it is. So for me, the challenge that faces us in our generation at this time is a challenge around identity and belonging. And I think it's a critical challenge in front of us as we start to wrestle with, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as we wrestle with our levels of identity and belonging to the construct which is Australia. But this is equally a challenge of identity and belonging for each of us as Australians, for us to say, this is the blueprint, the backbone, the kind of, cornerstone legal document that says this is Australia. And what are we going to have in there? So it's a challenge that faces not only the blackfellas in Australia, but all of us. Whether you are descendants of those first Europeans who arrived in tall ships, or whether you have come to Australia ever since then, or whether you have got the lineage that links you back to the most ancient peoples on earth, by virtue of calling this place home, you and I have a quest, have a challenge before us around how we're going to craft our sense of belonging by allowing the document that holds the fabric of the legal systems and states together, and how that is going to be reflective of us or not. So there's an interesting story with this constitution stuff. Most Australians, the constitution is out of our reach. There's polling that was done 2 years ago, I think last year, the polling was done, and 30% of Australians are like, I didn't even know we had a constitution, I don't know what you're talking about. Then, a further 60% or so of Australians are like, I thought we had like a Bill of Rights, or there was rights protections in there. I thought you guys already had a good deal in the Constitution, things like that. And so it's like, well, so we're dealing with a concept, an idea, a narrative, a little story that most Australians aren't connected with. A story about how the 6 colonies pulled together a document and then sent it to the Crown and said, this document federates us and allows us to form a nation. And it will be Western Australia and South Australia, Queensland, all that. So that's how there's a narrative there that most of us Australians are disconnected with. We don't know of it. So part of our challenge that we face in the recognised movement is twofold. One is our Australian culture of forgetfulness. We either deliberately or just by chance forget critical things in our own history, and we can then blame the history departments or the education system, or we can just blame a lack of Google access or something like that. We can just blame whatever, but the point is we have a culture that has blotted out and forgotten cornerstone or particular parts of our Australian history that have formed our sense of identity and who we are now. We've got a culture of forgetting it. And so the reconciliation movement of the 90s faced that challenge of the culture of forgetfulness. Because in that decade, what was happening was people were saying, this is the reality of why we need a reconciliation pact, agreement, why we need a focus on reconciliation and building our country together. And people were saying, really? That happened in Australia? Really? They took the children away? Really? Really? Terra nullius wasn't right? Really? So Australians are still caught in that culture of forgetfulness, like, really, you guys aren't in the Constitution? Really, it was just written by a couple of blokes in a room? Really? What, you're telling me that women didn't vote on passing the Constitution? Really? So we have this vague recollection of our history as Australian population. Now, the conversation about constitutional recognition, we face the challenge of having to walk Australians through their own history, our own history, how the history of Australia's formation as a country, its history of dispossession, its history of colonisation, its history of how instrumental different people were and different laws and policies were on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we still get Australians saying, really? That really happened. So history and our culture of forgetfulness, this is a challenge with any movement. So the constitutional recognition conversation, the movement, the campaign for us to get constitutional recognition faces a challenge around how Australians have got to wrestle with their own history. That's the first thing. Then the second thing that is a challenge, that is one of the things that we have to wrestle with in this movement, is the lack of Australians' awareness around civic education. We're very poor at understanding what it means for us to participate in the civic reality or our civic participation as citizens of this country. We are taking for granted the freedoms that we have here in Australia. So what happens is that most Australians have a lack of understanding around levels of government, how laws are passed, who's in control of what, who has the jurisdiction over what, who has the authority to pass what. And we're caught in this dilemma because we're talking about a constitution that sits above any party politics, a constitution that primarily outlines the breakdown of power between Commonwealth and state jurisdictions. And most Australians are going, what? How does it work? And then we have to walk Australians through that. So this is even before we have entered a conversation about its relationship to treaty, sovereignty, and all others. So even before we've started a conversation to say, this is how constitutional recognition interacts or is related to or has an impact on or can be seen alongside of. Before we've even started there, we're having to walk Australians through our own history narrative about how we formed a country and our own history narrative or our own civic education around how we as citizens can change the Constitution. It's fantastic when I meet the pragmatics of ordinary Australians saying, what? That's ridiculous. Let's just change it. I'll change it right now. I'll just get in there with a pen right now and I'll change it. So good on you, mate, but that's not how we can do it, you know? That's fantastic. But keep that spirit up. But what we have to do is we have to get all of the Australians who are on the electoral roll to rock up on a Saturday and actually make their mark to say that they are going to, deliberately vote. So this can't be done by somebody just leaning over and just, there it is, it's done. We changed the Constitution. So even getting our heads around all of that, that's part of our challenge. But that's why it is a campaign not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander aspiration, it is a campaign for all of us as Australians. What does it mean for us as Australians to have a document that was crafted at a time when Australians genuinely believed, when the white Australians who were here genuinely believed that the Aboriginal people were a dying race? Even the concept at the time in the late 1890s, mid to late 1890s, even the conceptual framework around race, that there was a white race, that there was a black race, that there was an other race, an Asian race, there was a different country. Even that thinking. As humans, we don't think like that anymore. Most of us don't think like that anymore. Some people may hold on to that framework, that frame of reference. But most of the world has moved on to the recognition that there is a human race and that there are ethnicities, and that there are cultures, and there are ways that people express themselves, but fundamentally we are the same human race. And that there is not a superiority of one race over the other. Most people in the world will ascribe to that notion. We have to acknowledge that there are those who don't. Some still believe that there is a superiority of particular people than others, but we would hope, and we certainly believe, that that's not the majority. So the narrative on the constitutional formation is that it was formed back at that time. There was all kinds of pressures on the colonies that were here on this continent to try and think about should we federate. And you think, what were they afraid of? What was the thing that was causing them to bind together and say, let's set up this because we can't survive as separate colonies. The Western Australian colony, the Queensland colony, the New South Wales colony. Let's form together. Let's actually make the coastal boundary of this place, let's make that one country. That's a good idea, isn't it? That's what they thought at the time. And so that was driving them to federate. So the Constitution is a document for that federation, to get those colonies to combine together. And so they had to set out, well then, what's fair, what's not fair? Well, if you guys get that, then we want this. And if you can have that, then we want that. And well, then what will this Commonwealth look like? Who's going to host the Commonwealth? Sydney and Melbourne, you might think, why can't it be in Perth? Why can't we have the head of the Commonwealth in Perth? It's ridiculous. Well, let's go over here then. So there's all these big conversations. In those arguments, though, were also the arguments about, well, what are we going to do about the Indians, about the Afghans, about the Chinese, and about the Aborigines? What are we going to do about them? And so, in those arguments, one of the outcomes of those arguments was Section 25 of our Australian Constitution. And Section 25 outlines that a state government has the power to deny the right of any race of people in a state election. That's a power that they can exercise. It's not written in the past tense that they had the power and no longer have the power. It's still in the present tense. They have the power. So you and I live here in Queensland. Queensland government still has that power. We could say, well, then why are we just not going to use it? But that's a conversation about 2015. I'm talking about that back then. That was their legitimate argument. We need to do it. And then we find out, we discover that the basis for that is that they didn't want to favour Queensland and Western Australia because we had more natives. The jurisdiction of Queensland Colony had more natives in it than the jurisdiction of New South Wales. The jurisdiction of Western Australian Colony had more natives in it. And so if Western Australia was to allow all their natives to vote, then that would be unfair. This was a legitimate argument in the formation of the Constitution of Australia. So that's in section 25. The other significant race-related section is in section 51. And in there it outlined that the Commonwealth would have the power to make any law based for any race of people. And when they wrote it, back in 1900, when they wrote the Constitution, they said the Commonwealth will have the power to make laws for any race, except Aborigines. And back then, they believed that the state jurisdictions, the colonies, ought to have the power to deal with their native populations. This was the thinking back then. This was the thinking of the white men and women who were having the debates, and it was ultimately the thinking of the white men who made the vote to cast the Australian Constitution into existence. So even then, the diversity that we knew to be in existence on this continent, in this land, did not have a say in questioning or raising, ideas to the alternative of that. So we didn't have the Aboriginal Congress rocking up and saying, "Excuse me, I think that what you're doing is quite racist." That political agency didn't exist for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people back then. So the formation held these two quite strongly racist sentiments in the Constitution at that time. And we find ourselves fast forwarding then to 1967. Interestingly, the Australian Constitution can only be changed when it has what's called a double majority. That means each state jurisdiction has to have a majority of vote to say, yes, we want to change it. But then the overall count of all the voters in Australia has to also be in the majority. That's why it's really difficult to change. When you think back to the colonial mind, back in the 1890s, late 1890s, they wanted to make it hard to change because otherwise they would keep changing all the time, and then one jurisdiction would get favourable and the next one, and so they had to make it really difficult for them to change it. So what it means is that out of the 44 times that the Australian public has been asked to change the Australian Constitution, only 8 times it's actually changed. One of those 8 was 1967. And 1967 is a high point, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for our national narrative, because it was the highest mark that ever voters had said, we want to make a change to the Constitution. It wasn't like, 51, 52, it's 91.5, nearly 92% of Australians said, we are going to change the Constitution to favour equality for Aboriginal people. In 1967, a high point in our national narrative. That was on the 27th of May 1967. Some of us may have a mental image of the postcard that was out there at the time, the poster that was there, where it was popular, the yes vote for this young Aboriginal woman. Give her a future of equality, like all of us as Australians would enjoy. And popularly, we believed as Australians that was what we were doing, giving them the yes vote, giving them equality. In reality, we were doing a little bit less than that, but still it was a very positive and powerful step forward. One of the significant changes within the document was that section 51, section 26, 51, 26, 51 brackets 26, that particular part that said the Commonwealth will have power to make laws for any race except Aborigines. Put a line through that, except Aborigines. And I said, no, that's not right. Aboriginal people should have the Commonwealth making standard laws right across the board, so that the way that we mistreat Aboriginal people in Queensland will not be the same way that they mistreated in Western Australia. They will be treated better right across the board because the Commonwealth will be looking across all of it. So we felt as a nation that we were doing something right, and we were, but it was only in part. Because our challenges that immediately followed that was, how do we live up to that? How do we live up to the aspiration of equality here in Australia? And in many ways we failed that. But we saw the rise of our politicised Aboriginal organisations that began to say, we're going to self-determine our future. We are going to improve our legal status. We are going to improve the way that we are treated in terms of healthcare. We are going to start to improve our educational access. We are going to do this because we have to. And it was tremendous agency, political agency of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the early 70s. And I was born in 1971, so there's political agency right there. So I came into the world and said, yes, I want to do my bit now. We began, for example, 1971 was also the Tent Embassy. It's the longest continuous protest. You know, it's like, yeah, it's changed its form, it wasn't the tent that it was, but it's always been there. It's always been there as a constant reminder that we have still got to get things right here in the country. So, put that aside. So the campaign for constitutional recognition is to remove those racist clauses in the Constitution. Remove the racism that was seen as to be part of reasonable thinking back in 1890s, but is no longer the reasonable thinking of Australians who live in 2015. We no longer want the stench of racism in the document that governs the way that our governments interact with each other. We don't want to smell any longer that scent that says, well, we could if we wanted to, but we won't, because, you know. And part of the challenge with this is that you and I as Australians are still saying, look, we're not racist, but we do have the power to stop anyone of any race from voting in an election. Yeah, but we're not racist. But we just want that power to remain in our document. So that's key to what we're trying to achieve. Now the alarming thing is that the removal of the racism is only secondary to this whole process of recognition. Recognition has been on the policy platform for both parties for over a decade. But it really came into light when the Gillard government had to really negotiate with the independents to form government. And it was like, okay, well, here's a policy platform that we really need to elevate. It was around when the conversation about the Republic was there, the preamble to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's been around for more than a decade. But when the expert panel was travelling around the country listening to people to see if there was an appetite for recognition, it became clear to them that we can't put something in the document that says we will recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they're the first peoples of this land, etc., their culture, their history, and they've been here for thousands and thousands of years, but we want to hold the right to stop anyone of any race from voting in the state election. Like, oh, that doesn't make sense, that you can honour the ancient history and current cultural reality of the first peoples of the land, and then hold the right to say that anyone of any race can be blocked out of it. So you hold racism, but you acknowledge, and they said, look, you've got to get rid of the racism, and you've got to put proper acknowledgement. So as it boils down to it, the campaign for constitutional recognition is essentially about that. It's about removing the racism that's in existence in the Australian Constitution. And it is about replacing, putting into there proper recognition of the first peoples of this land. The collection of words that will take and its exact location in the document is still being talked about, is still being up in conversation. And you would have heard, possibly you would have heard that there are a couple of different kinds of models around, well, maybe we could do this, or maybe we could do that. Possibly we could do this. And where you're finding now Australians are trying to come up with ideas and ways to make this palatable, able to be consumed, able to be understood by ordinary Australians right across the board. There's a whole spectrum of Australians that will need to get their head around this. One of the things for me is that I sit in food courts because I've got kids who want to always eat junk food and stuff, and I try to get them to eat salads. I never eat salads. So we go to food courts all the time. And as I'm sitting in food courts, I'm looking around at all my fellow Australians and I'm thinking, man, these mob got to get their heads around constitutional recognition. This is a big job, you know? I'm not sure of the exact numbers that are on the Australian electoral roll, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of 16 million, possibly 14 million Australians, who will rock up on a Saturday to cast their vote. For me, the opportunity for us as Australians that's before us is that we will have a moment of consciousness that won't be decided by the parliaments, it won't be decided by the High Court on our behalf, it will be decided by us going to the ballot box and us saying, yes, I want to recognise that these are the first peoples. They were, and they still are, the first peoples of this land. That is cornerstone to my understanding of identity as an Australian person. And as an Australian, that stuff about that racism, it belongs 2 centuries ago. When my kids go, oh Dad, that's so last year. Well, I'm talking about 2 centuries ago. That thinking is still there, governing the way our governments react. So, my challenge, and one of the reasons why I see this as important for all of us, is that we have a moment that comes around possibly once every generation to do something that will punctuate our narrative. And it will punctuate it in a way that says we as Australians set right something. We as Australians took one moment to set right a missing part of our history. The culture of forgetfulness has been overcome with regard to the existence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We no longer hold the view as Australian people as like, oh, I don't know, I think they're dying out. That's no longer our view as Australians. You try and sell, from a tourism point of view, people coming to Australia without mentioning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. See what you can sell, you know? Yeah, we've got an opera house in a harbour bridge and a Gold Coast and a surf, but at some point, international visitors will say, I want to hear about, I want to see, I want to experience something to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Last time I came back through the international airport, picking up my luggage, met with the screen that had these Aboriginal people dancing around. I'm like, that's great, that's fantastic, but I'm like, that was filmed at the back of La Perouse, I think, you know, the screen and everything. And in a way, it's like, there's something great and something also a little bit like, is this really us as Australians? Or are we just promoting this because it makes good sales, you know? We have a chance to actually move beyond the superficial acknowledgement, the superficial sort of, we love the Black peoples, we love the Aborigines, we love it. Saying this is cornerstone to who we are as Australians. When we formed this country, when we took over this land, we didn't do the right thing. But now we have an opportunity to acknowledge that they are the people of this land. And none of our documents will have that silenced any longer. There once was a time when prime ministers and governor generals and governors and people of notable elected representation didn't even acknowledge country. There was that time. Sir William Dean, as the Governor General, was instrumental in making it common practice. People hated him for that. Because why would you acknowledge that there's a rightful ownership of the land underneath the building? It's a painful reminder that we didn't do it right, that we didn't pay for the site to build South Bank. We didn't pay for the site. That's a painful reminder. So I understand why, as Australians, we want to blot that out and forget it. But we've got an opportunity as Australians to say, we're not going to buy the culture of forgetfulness any longer. We're going to buy the culture of honouring our past, honouring it properly. We want to recognise the First Peoples of this land and get rid of the racism that's in that document, because we've got bucket loads of work to do around health, housing, education, and everything else. We've got bucket loads of work to do. We can't keep doing this while we say we're here to help you, but but you're not in our document at all. Now, we've still got heaps of time, in terms of us being able to have a conversation. So I want to open up a bit of a conversation with you, because one of the things that really brought to my mind about this dialogue was that I like to see this dialogue as a conversation about identity and belonging. Because what's critical for me as an Indigenous person in Australia is I have to face a complex question around whether I really see myself as Australian or not. That's difficult as a proposition for me to really own. So I'm genuinely wondering, for those Australians who don't have Indigenous heritage, what this proposition of recognition means for you. Does it mean that you get to say something on behalf of other Australians? Or does this mean that it's actually going to put a more strong foundation of your belonging to this country? Or, like me, do you genuinely have a complex, difficult challenge about having a sense of belonging to this land as Australians? What does it mean for us to genuinely be Australian? Particularly when we live in a country where our fellow Australians who fly the Australian flag, that symbol of the Australian flag in someone's yard is not actually a symbol that I'm welcome. Recent research has shown us that those who genuinely fly that flag and promote that flag so strongly are actually opposed to the diversity that is Australia. So that becomes actually quite painful that my neighbours 2 houses down across the road, that if I rocked up there and said, "Hey, my fellow Australian, what's up, us?" that they would probably say, "I don't speak your language, go back to where you come from." Us, come on, I'm from here, This is a challenge for us as Australians. How do we hold on? We saw it recently with Gallipoli narrative, 100 years of that event. And we saw some Australians grabbing that and holding it really close and saying that's a cornerstone to who we are. And we saw other Australians go, why are we doing that? Our sense of belonging won't be rectified by clever clauses in that document. But as long as we have an absence of any recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are continuing to say that being Australian means you don't have to recognise that. Being Australian and being this whole construct of Australia doesn't have to recognise blackface. And I don't want to live in that country. I want to live in a country where we acknowledge the truth, where we can own up to our own checkered history. Some of the stuff we look at and we go, we're ashamed of. Some of the stuff we look at and we should feel proud of. But how do we own that if the cornerstone document gives us no license to do that, because it's just absent? And how can we own that if the cornerstone document still makes it permissible, allowable for us to be racist? So my challenge, I held 2 challenges, lifelong challenges. First lifelong challenge is to see a proper war dance done in response to the haka. That's an essential challenge. I've seen it done with 15-year-old Indigenous boys when we went to PNG. They did it. I've seen it done, I've seen those same 15-year-old boys teach AFL players, and that was a profound moment when Adam Goods turned around to his 15-year-old fellow and said, "You've taught me the first Aboriginal dance I've ever done." It's a profound moment. So I've seen that. But I'm yet to see when the wallabies or kangaroos confront up to the New Zealand side who does a haka, for them to go, "Here's our response. From this land, from the First Peoples, we as Australians are proud of it." So if we can sort that out tonight, that would be great. And the second one is much harder, and I feel more emotive about this, and that is that when we see the flag, we feel welcome. Because right now, whenever I see that flag, a flag that I've got some sort of relationship because it is my national flag, because I am an Australian, when I see that, my instinctive response is, I don't know if, I'll be honest, my instinctive response is, they're not going to accept me. Even though I'm First Peoples of this land. Even though I've got a heart for an Australian sense of identity and belonging, when I see that flag, I don't feel like I can rock up to them and say, "Hey, my brother, my fellow Australian." Constitutional recognition goes a step towards creating an Australia where those things can happen. Constitutional recognition will require millions of Australians to say they want to recognise. Millions of Australians saying they want to set things right. Millions of Australians saying they want to get rid of racist clauses in our cornerstone document. That moment in our national consciousness should be a moment where we as Australians can move on to next phase of identity, belonging and togetherness. A pathway forward that can offer all kinds of conversations, including conversations about how we will form treaties, how we will form and recognise different forms of sovereignty, how we will interact with each other based on different ethnicities, how we will form a sense of cultural sensitivity, a cultural competency as a nation. Those conversations are much more possible once we've been through a process of proper recognition. So that's my story I wanted to share with you tonight, and I want to open up for some conversations, questions, etc. Thank you.
Mark, I'll take the guy that kicks off. And my sister's here going to young you first. My name's Brent. I actually grew up out at Capalaba with my family that way. They're originally from down in Victoria. I want to start by saying I share so many similar thoughts. And my head's going 100 miles an hour in terms of what I want to say, but I love the inclusiveness around the words that you use and your attitude, and agree with pretty much 100% of what you just said. But I was waiting for the flag issue to come up because I share the exact same feelings when I look at that flag as a white Australian, and I look at those feelings and go, hang on a second, that doesn't represent who I believe that we are as a country, but I'll keep it simple. How do I encourage the conversation as a white Australian? And I should need to say as a white Australian because we're all one, but unfortunately time calls to say yes. But how do I encourage that conversation with my circle of friends who are all predominantly white around moving the conversation forward, which will obviously be a watershed moment in Australian history if we get there, which will then hopefully open up the conversation with things like the flag anthem and so on. But what are some simple and easy things that I can do to move it forward?
Yeah, well, I think one of the icebreakers for us as Aussies is to acknowledge that we're all prejudiced. We have to own that each of us have a prejudice, because we judge others. We just do, because we're humans. The key for us, though, as Australians, is what we do with that judgment. Because I can judge whiteys, or I can judge those people, whoever those are, you know? We just put, blank space, inverted commas, you put in any group of people, I don't know, surfers, skaters, I don't know, just some sort of people. People who have beards, I don't know, somebody, mohawks. So we will judge those people. And I think one of our challenges is to actually own that. It's because one of the things I find is that when you start mentioning, we shouldn't be racist. I'm not racist towards Aboriginal. I just know that they get free taxis and they get better home loans and they also get all this stuff and we never get anything. And then it's like, hold on, what's going on here now? But you can have conversations with your friends that I will never have. I was recently in a road stop between Wilcannia and Broken Hill. And two white fellas at the counter were saying some stuff, and I just overheard as I was approaching the counter, well, you know how we treat the black fellas. And just as I approached, I was like, man, I wish I was, had some invisibility power just to let them keep going with the conversation. Because you can speak about your experience and how you have judged others more than what I can speak about how you have judged me, if you know what I'm saying. Because the moment I turn up to your circle of friends and say, hey, you mom, you've got to think about the way you treat Aboriginal people. They're like, oh, yeah, you know, always do. Just don't do any bad to us. I don't know what that is. But you can have a conversation with them that talks about your experience, because you know what it's like to see people and go, no, I'm not like them. But hold on a second, they're actually Australians as well. But you and I live in a country where it's permissible for the governments to actually be racist to them. And if the country was dominated, if the governments were dominated by brown skins, then we could use those powers against you. So, whoa, that's all an archaic view of race anyway. So you and I, as Australians, have different experiences because of the colour of our skin and the way people judge us. We should just own up to that fact. We should get on with the business of saying the document's got to be fixed. We know that Aboriginal people have been here for thousands of years. The document should say that. We know that when the white fellas got here, they didn't sign a treaty, they didn't buy it, and they didn't, say, okay, you mob, you're all part of the crown now. They just rocked up here and then said, no, nobody owns it. We found it vacant. We started squatting on here. That's our history, because you and I are Australians. But that's also your history, because as part of the white Australians, that's part of your legacy. And you and your mates should just own up to that and just say, we just got to fix it. Doesn't mean we all have to join a reconciliation group and hold hands and chant Aboriginal skin names. But we can set things right as Australians. Just fix it, sorry. We can chant Aboriginal skin names. But see, this is part of the challenge. It's either a sign up, you've got to be all the way to the left side of politics. You'll be a bleeding heart for the Aboriginal people. You don't have to be. But we can't live in a country that makes it permissible to be racist. We just can't. We can't live in a country that continues to lie about the existence of our Aboriginal people. We've been here for thousands and thousands of years. So that's a conversation that I'd encourage you to have, to say, almost to get on that practical side of it. Let's just get it fixed. And when they come to you with they get free home loans, just say, where do you get that information from?
I have very similar conversations about our asylum seeker policy as well. Different sort of myths that are around that one. And it's even like on the way here tonight and yesterday, and thinking about the flag issue around, I don't, from what I've seen, and I'm 29 years old, but I don't think we're mature enough as a country to even have the conversation, let alone look at the ramifications of it. But it's obviously things like this that go a long way forward, and me talking to my small group of white friends to sort of move that on. And I think, bit by bit we'll chip away and slowly get there.
Just on that point about bit by bit, what this offers us is an opportunity to actually point the ship in a different direction. All the bit by bit stuff that we do around, let's do a little bit here, a little bit there, we're closing the gap, we're making some adjustments. We get 20 million Australians with blackfellas on the brain at one moment. 20 million Australians to say, let's set this right, is actually a redirection of the ship. The whole ship turns. Not a little tiny bit. It's like, look, we've all got to go there. We've all got to rock up on Saturday. It's going to be a powerful moment when we actually turn it. So, next, there's a question over here as well, so I
have two questions. I have two questions. The first is kind of like that question. It's about how do I approach Indigenous people about this? Can I wear that shirt?
on the shirt side, absolutely.
All right.
This particular one, but the whole idea of this recognition is about all Australians, right?
Yeah.
So all of us ought to be wearing the shirt. And if I could, create a campaign for anything, I'd love to have, when people do casual Fridays, everyone's wearing an R shirt. We walk in that Queen Street, we'll say, hey brother, hey, recognise, and then you probably get other mobs saying, who do you think you are, where are you wearing that shirt for?
Yeah.
This is about us as Australians, all of us, saying we're going to get it right.
Yeah.
We're just going to sort it out. It's not about making the jump over to, well, I'm now going to be in the Aboriginal camp on everything. But it is about us as Australians saying, we can't avoid that this is still here. So yes, wear the shirt, grab the shirt. Go to recognise.org.au, order one online, it'll get to you really quick. I've got a couple of spare shirts, XL.
All right.
But I'd encourage you to have the conversation at the level and the knowledge base that we've got. Here's another thing that really stops our conversations, is that people turn it back on you and say, well, what do you know about black folks? What do you know about Aboriginal people? And then all of a sudden, Australians are like, they're caught like heart stops. It's like, oh man, I haven't lived in an Aboriginal community. I don't know who I went to school with is Aboriginal. I don't know enough about, I don't know the skin names. I don't know the traditional languages. I don't know nothing. It's like, stop it. Do you care that this is in existence? Do you care that as an Australian, that this stuff is still around? Then if you care, then do something about it. Don't wait until you've read, 100 novels about Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history.
Yeah.
Certainly learn and study more, but also as an Australian, we should just get on with it. Be very pragmatic, be very practical about it. Because we can't stop ourselves from doing something we know is right, because we just fear that we don't know enough about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Places like this have a wealth of knowledge for us to learn more. So you do a Google search on anything, or even any other search engine, if there's any other search engine in existence, type in something that says Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's history. And you see that there's tons of information. So there's no challenge with that. The inhibitor is in us authorising ourselves to have the conversation, to hold our own. When you'll get some white fella who will come to you and say, you don't know about black folks, I went to school with black folks. I used to live in and now tell you about how, blah, blah. And for you to say, well, this is my experience and this is why I want to do it. That's what we have to do. Otherwise we all might as well close. Because I can give you evidence, very strong evidence, that Australia remains racist. I could have made the whole talk tonight about how I've had bad experiences and how people that I've known have continued to have bad experience, racism, sexism, religious hatred. But that's not all of who we are. That's part of the reality of the stuff that's out there in the world, but that's not all of who we are. And so I would strongly encourage you to authorise yourself, back yourself, to say, I can do this. I'm going to wear the R because I want to do this. I want to see that change happen. Yeah, that's what I do.
Can I ask one second question? Just, sorry. Thank you. My second question is probably a bit more complex. Do you think there's a relationship between the question about potentially becoming a republic and potentially recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution?
They're certainly related in a bigger sense, but they're not related in the shorter sense. At the moment, you and I live with, the royals as the Queen is still the head of state here in Australia. The Governor General is her representative. And if you've seen anything about the media, you would have noticed that William and Kate had a baby girl. Right? There's something about that family that has to remain in our consciousness for a reason. We're still related there. On the question of republic, we would hope that if we become a nation that wants to move into a republic, that we would carry our sentiment of who we are as Australians from now into that entity. So if we don't get recognition for our peoples in this setup, why are we going to wait until we get a republic conversation and try and set it up right then? Why not live for the next, I don't know, how long it's going to take, 10 years, 5 years, 100 years, I don't know. Depends what William and Kate want to do with us. But in a real sense, when Australia matures to that point of saying, we want to now have a republic conversation, I would hope that we've practiced years and years of proper recognition, rather than us saying, oh, no, don't, I don't want to recognise you right now, Mark. I prefer to recognise you when I'm a republic. What? Why?
Yeah.
So why not? We've got a window, and the Prime Minister said that he really likes that date, the synchronicity of Saturday, 27th of May, 2017 is 50 years. He likes the idea of that date. Who knows when the date will actually be? But we've got a window up until one date, and we can set some things right, and then practice living on the other side of that. And then, who knows, in the future we might republicarize ourselves. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Good day, my name is Amin. I come from the best nation in the world, that's Coolin, where we had 13,000 people protest in Melbourne. But I'm not Indigenous, but I think we're up there. I always get confused about my own identity. Who am I? Like, I've struggled with feeling, I don't feel Australian in terms of, if I think of the whole continent, it's too big and it's too broad. If you go to Richmond or Footscray or somewhere in Melbourne, and it's just a huge amount of Vietnamese people living a Vietnamese lifestyle. You go to the interior, wherever, there's all these different, it's such a complex place, this continent. And to try and think of my identity as Australian, it only happens occasionally. And you actually did it because you said, I wore dance in front of the haka. And that's where I think Australians unite in sport. But I can't see it elsewhere. I don't know, does anyone else sort of have it? You have an idea of how we are knitted together, apart from the fact that we're on this big lump of land together. Is there something that really puts us together? Well, it does, that big piece of land. So, number one, identity. Struggling with the identity of being non-Indigenous. I feel primarily I'm English, I'm not Australian. And primarily I'm from Victoria, and my religion also, I'm a Muslim, that is part of my religion. Trying to get my head around the racism part, there's no, that's gone. But I think one of the things people struggle with recognising is once it's recognised in the Constitution, how does the conversation continue? That's what I want to know. How do you continue that? Because for me, there's a lot of change that needs to happen in terms of the way this Constitution is structured to manage this continent. Because, for example, this is just neo-colonialism, what we have now. We just have 6 colonies becoming 6 states. I can't see how the government of Brisbane, where it's located now, can govern effectively in New York, for example. There's no knowledge of, and I just think the whole structure needs to be changed. But people who are saying no to recognition are aspiring for something higher. But I'm really glad I came to listen to what you said, because I think, yes, you do need to be pragmatic. But what I want to know is, how will the conversation continue? I don't want the ruling class to say, okay, we voted on that, it's all done and dusted, we've got their rights. What happens after that? Because it's a huge struggle to keep going on until the gap is closed. What is it enough? You want to respond to anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no conception, no misunderstanding that the push to the vote and the inclusion of the words is by any means a done and dusted moment.
Yeah.
If anything, it is a moment for momentum to press on, to keep going. The lessons of history of 1967, for example, teach us a number of things. They teach us that if we think that going to vote and then somehow someone would do something at some point, that's the part of that collapsed between 67 and the early 70s. It was like, okay, well, this will be taken up, won't it? Yes. By who? Well, we're not actually sure. And so for a whole host of reasons, the people who campaigned for the inclusion or the constitutional change of 67 then went on to continue to campaign for self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They maintained their fight for recognition and rights, etc. And I have got, every belief that what will happen post this referendum will be people will continue to work, but they'll be continuing to work in a different environment. It won't be the case that once the words appear that all of a sudden that you and I will, I don't know, like those magic commercials where we go from black and white to, colour, or we used to look like that, and then through 30 minutes a day we ended up looking like this, It's not going to be that sort of stuff. No one's got that misconception. But the idea that we will continue to press on because we have to pragmatically, but we also have to aspirationally. This can't be the end of the recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The end game is not to say, well, look, it's there in the Constitution. Now, can you just please let us get on with the real stuff of Australia? The hope is that once it's there, that we can continue to work on. So now, who are we? How will we be? What other things do we need to continue to work on? And that's why my brothers and sisters who will disagree with me on pursuing this recognition, because they want to make more primary the pursuit for treaty, for example. That's why for me it's like, the more you maintain a push for that, the less appetite there will be for Australians to feel like they can participate in that. We have a moment for Australians to participate in something that will ultimately benefit a consciousness, a sense of momentum to continue to work, to do stuff.
I think it's hard once, because the wording is not out there yet.
Correct, yeah.
And once the wording's out, then I think the arguments can be put more easily to everyone. This is a good thing to do.
Yes, you're right. I mean, the two elements that remain missing in this campaign is, one is the clarity around the wording. So what is actually being proposed? We have ideas about what's being proposed from the reports of the expert panel and the report from the parliamentary committees. So those things give us a really good indication of the kind of things that are being proposed. And we don't have the actual wording yet. That's one. The other thing we don't have is the actual date, so we don't know what we're building up for. So this momentum, though, is about us saying, do we want to lean into this because it's the right thing to do, or do we want to lean back and say, well, once I get the right words in the right way, and I know it's going to be, it's going to be less loss, more gain, then I'll do it. And what I'm arguing for, what I'm committed to, is the belief that it is absolutely more gain for us as Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, but also for us as Australians.
Just recognise that the organisation acknowledge the 26th, is it, of May, 26th of May, as the goal, or it's an agreement already in place?
There is no official.
No.
There's no official date set.
Okay.
But we've got to keep rolling the machinery towards something.
Yeah. So, if the wording's not ready by that date, then it won't happen.
In terms, as I understand
it, agreement between the community.
In terms of, as I understand it, in terms of process, and I'm maybe corrected on this for sure, is that the Parliamentary Committee will release their report by the 30th of June this year, and that will have the kind of wording that will be the model, for example. You might have picked up in the media a couple of weeks back, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition were looking to have a meeting with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leaders, and that is one of the key things that is also needing to happen, so that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leaders can say, this is the sort of model that would really work for, most of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, most of Australians. So there's a couple of things that are still being worked towards. But once that model is out, as I understand it, there is at least 1 year that's forecast before the date comes. So there'll be plenty of time for all of us as Australians to say, we should change those words because of this. And we can have a very strong and direct, informed debate because the model is there in front of us. This conversation at the moment is about our willingness to support this process because we believe in what the aspiration and the direction of this process.
Yeah, I think it's important to get the words out there because it's really hard to say yes or vote for this when you actually don't know what those words are. There's no argument about yes, it should happen, but you really do need to know what has been said because these white buggers are tricky, really, really tricky. And if you get it wrong, they might stuff you up for another 50 years. And you've got to get the wording right.
Yes, the wording, getting the wording right is utterly important.
Yeah.
We have a spectrum of Australians who are for it, who are against it, for a whole host of reasons. But once the wording is out there, it will be placed in a way that most of us Australians can say that's what we want to go for. Because it's strong enough for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices to feel like it's been recognised properly, but it's also general enough so that conservative Australians and others who are a little bit sceptical or a bit cynical about it can also say that's good. That helps us to move forward. So that's one here.
So thank you for your talk, it's quite inspirational. I'm just asking, my name's Dinesh, I'm asking whether anyone has any thoughts about the most effective means of getting the conversation happening. Like I agree, conversations amongst individuals are very important, but also what role is there to play in getting it louder, right? If anyone has any thoughts, like from their own experience, what relatively effective means might be. And whoever wants the mic.
But just to get people warmed up on that question, the question was to the audience, it wasn't just to me. This is the first referendum that's being held in the age of social media. Even the referendum on the whether to become a republic or not, there was no social media like it is now. And So we often in these talks we get suggestions about, oh, have you guys got a Facebook thing? With it? Oh yeah, there's like 200,000 people on Facebook who are having this conversation about this stuff. The getting it out there is important. It's a job for all of us. Recognised campaign, recognised organisation has been instructed and has been directed towards the support and awareness of this constitutional recognition. So our job is to get it out there. But as ordinary Australians, all of us, like with everything else, can make that ripple effect go further. So the way that we can interact with organisational structures that we are part of, things that we are members of, there's a whole raft of ways that we can do that. Recognised as an organisation does have dedicated people looking at social media, also dedicated people looking at schools, organisations, sporting codes, the whole works in terms of part of our challenge is what you were talking about before earlier on, is that we're at the stage of raising awareness for something, and those other elements, the exact wording and the date, they'll kickstart our whole different phase of the campaign. A different phase because we'll be talking about concrete words, we'll be talking about concrete date, and you'll see the rise at that point. But there's nothing stopping us from generating as much noise about this as we can possibly.
And also, I was just going to say there's education, right? But it's education's a hard thing to change if you're not out. But it's it's one of the most significant ways in which you change a culture.
So we have 7 minutes remaining, so any questions and comments?
Thank you very much for your talk there. I was just reflecting on, as you're talking, had lunch today with a friend of mine, and I said I was coming to this, and he said, oh, that's interesting enough. I said, but it was interesting just on my opposite side, because what he said to me is, he said, look, if the words are right, I'll tick the box, basically. He said, but why put so much energy in? Why don't you get on with other stuff like health, other issues? So it's interesting to get your reflection, because I think you get a sense of the depth of why that is, which I couldn't really answer it that well, to be quite honest. I could answer in certain amounts, but and I suspect there'd be quite a lot of people who are a bit like that. If it's right, I tick the box, but it's not a big deal. It's just something that's got to be done, and then you move on to other more important things. So I'd just be interested on your reflections on that conversation.
Well, my immediate answer when faced with that question about, well, why isn't there energy being put into other stuff? My immediate answer is energy is being put into other stuff. There are people who are working tirelessly, who have worked tirelessly on health, housing, education, the whole raft of all the social indicators. There are people who've worked tirelessly in juvenile justice and criminal justice. Everything that we can fathom, can think of, to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives, their livelihoods, their aspirations, even hearing the news driving in here about the very serious conversations about how do we get Year 12 retention in remote communities in the Northern Territory. It's not as though people have shut down all their work and we are now just focusing on the Constitution like it's some sort of artwork waiting to form in front of us. People are continuing to work tirelessly on all of those things. This campaign is about trying to change the words in the document. That is of significance to all of us as Australians. the work that's being done by others ought to be acknowledged and honoured as well. Part of the painful bits as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person working around this is the question around, well, how does this funding stuff start to split up? Because that's actually quite painful. When you hear people saying it's going to be really tough for us in the next couple of weeks because we have to let people go because we didn't get funding for the next round. That's actually really tough. And we're saying, oh, okay, I hope you recognise, you know, on something that we don't have the words for yet and the date is coming. But it's important. So we've got a partnership with a number of health organisations to use an example of how people who have worked tirelessly on that area around health, a whole raft of health coalition called Recognise Health, have come out with a statement in recent months. It was actually announced last month in April. They said that the work of constitutional recognition will have a beneficial effect on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. We've seen this in other parts of the world, and what we understand as health professionals is that it will change something significantly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is a step in closing the gap. They haven't resigned their post in order to come over. They are continuing their work, and that they're more or less saying, you keep doing your work of raising awareness, because that vote is actually going to make a difference to the work that we do every day. So I also, can think about, when looking at the flag and looking at the sense of education and history, how many more people will feel a sense of can participate in this society, because 8 out of 10 Australians in this food court, they actually voted to recognise us, to get racism out. That's going to make a change in our psyche. So it won't, I was about to say it won't happen overnight. That's a terrible thing, isn't it? Canteen ad. It doesn't have an immediate cause and effect. We know this. But what this can do for us as a generation, we can't underestimate it. All the other important work is currently being done. And my hope is that the work on the other side, that work will only have more momentum and more light and more funding, more energy from people saying, wow, if we're going to truly be these people as Australians, then let's fix this stuff. Let's not make a small effort to close the gap. Let's actually do a lot of work, all of us, to try and get this stuff done.
So would you use the language of identity rather than somebody use the language of symbolism versus practical? Would word be more identity around identity?
Yeah, just in terms of symbol and practical, to separate them, I think our public leaders in that debate around reconciliation did us a great disservice by separating it. Because you can't just have something symbolic without its practical cousin. You can't just do something practical without this symbolic stuff either. Putting a sticker on a building is an amazing symbolic gesture that actually means you're more welcome, because our organisation is in this land. I feel more welcome to go to that place. Just symbolic. Once I get in there, the substance, the practical work of what gets done in that building, whether people are culturally competent or not, that stuff has to get done. It's very practical work. So we were done a disservice by that separation. In one sense, this is a symbolic change. In one sense, it's a very practical change. Let's get rid of racism, racist thoughts that were around the 1890s. Let's get rid of it. Practical. Symbolic, this can be a highlight, a punctuated narrative point in our country. They're much closer than what people have given us before. We are running close to time, and we're going to have to wrap up. I think we have time for one more very quick comment, and then I'm going to close. Is that okay?
I'd like to ask a question, make a comment. This is a government-funded campaign, right? So, me as a young Aboriginal woman, I find it really hard to not be cynical about why the government is putting millions of dollars into this campaign when it's the same government that are trying to shut down Aboriginal communities. And they're still, taking the children away in Northern Territory, and it's this is the same government. So if they're putting millions of dollars and all this time and energy into a campaign and finding black faces to speak up to try and get the rest of us on side, then how am I supposed to believe that that's for the good of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd encourage us to not be cynical, but to be very sceptical. We have to be critical and sceptical about this. It's certainly not helped, and one of our challenges, particularly as an Aboriginal person, but all of us involved in this, is to go, how can you expect us to think there's a brighter day when you give us with this hand, when you're doing this with the other? Absolutely. We have to carry that hypocrisy. We have to carry that. That's part of our challenge. To be clear, in terms of the millions, $5 million per annum to reach 20 million Australians, you start to do the mathematics on that, and it's actually not a lot of money to try and raise awareness to all of us. But still, when you're sitting across the table from people who've had their funding cut, and you say, yeah, we get 5 million a year, that's never fair. And there's no easy way around that. Part of our challenge, though, is to try and say, well, how do we work with this? Do I personally trust the government? That's a serious question. That's a sense of identity question. Do I actually trust this one or that one? Who would I prefer to be in power? And in one sense, I'm actually comforted by the reality that it doesn't matter who occupies that seat. The way that they occupy that seat almost doesn't matter, because this ultimately will be the choice of Australians, all of us as people. Now, I think it's terrible that we have to face the complex reality of closing our communities. I would hate to be on either side of that. I'd hate to be in a community that feels like it's going to be closed down, that is actually you're on the list to close down, and I'd hate to be in the government making that decision. I don't know what's in their heads. I don't know why they would make that decision, but I'd hate to be in that place to say, hi everyone, I'm actually closing down some communities here. That'd be a horrible decision to have to make. So they have to carry, and we all have to carry, that this is our messy reality right now. And what I can't do is I can't hold the government to ransom and say, until you do right by us, I'm not going to do right by you. I can't hold them to ransom. I could hold them to ransom if I didn't want to make progress. If I wanted to say my identity is outside of you, then I could hold them to ransom and say, I'm not going to partner with you. But my reality, for me personally, is that I have to partner with them and all of that messiness in order to get 20 million Australians to get their consciousness raised so that they will go, we have to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people properly. It is messy, it's not right what's happening now, and it's actually really, really painful to try and share the room, to share this journey with people who are on the one side benefiting from what's happening, and on the other side really not benefiting. That's our messy reality. And so I guess there's no easy way to answer that, but I would encourage you and would encourage all of us to not hold it cynically. Because when we become cynics, we can never see any light and any hope. But I would encourage you and all of us here to be very critical and very sceptical, because then we can start to say what is really going on here, and we can start to see some light as well and some hope. So that would be my response to that.